All right. So, what do we kind of learn from all our different sources of crime? And the basic questions are pretty straightforward. Like, what's going on with crime in the U.S. right now? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it relatively stable? How long has it been so? And why is that true? Like, what sort of things relate to increases and decreases in crime? Um, the other sort of issue is the general correlates of crime, like in terms of individual level data, what sort of things are related to crime, age, race, gender, social class, all those sorts of issues. What do we know from our various sources of data? And obviously, some of the stuff we're going to talk about off and on again throughout the course, but it's a good time right now to get kind of a baseline. Um, the starting point is to be skeptical. Every semester, I asked my students, and they don't get the same sort of data hunting assignment as you guys get for this topic. Um, but I ask them to find me an interesting stat, which I have you do in the context of the data you look at. But every semester, I get people that just go Google crime and they end up at websites called endoftheamericandream.com. So if you're at a website called endoftheamericandream.com, you might be suspicious that their data isn't going to be sort of on the up and up, that they might cherry pick things, that they might have misleading data, and so on and so forth. And both sides do it. That's more of a conservative spin. But you'll hear every time the Super Bowl rolls around, you'll hear people from the liberal side of the spectrum and some conservatives say something to the effect of there's 10,000 or 100,000 prostitutes that show up for the Super Bowl, that um, it's the biggest organization of sex crime in the U.S. and so on and so forth. Ask yourself, how would anybody know how many sex workers show up for the Super Bowl? If you go back and sort of try to track down the source of stats like that, you find out mostly they pull it out of thin air. That nobody really has a good estimate of how many people are prostituting at the Super Bowl. Having said that, don't get cross the line between being skeptical and being cynical. We're going to talk about some things that do work. We're going to talk about sort of what we're confident in what we know about crime. So um, we'll get there. But all right. So what do we know? That sort of baseline level. It's pretty clear from UCR data and NCVS data. So crime reported to the police, crime reported by victims in a survey, that there's a pretty large and steady decline in violent crime since early to mid 90s. I think it's like 92, 93, depends on the data you look at. And that a good chunk of that decrease is being driven by a really sharp decline in violent crime amongst juveniles, especially juveniles that are living in inner city areas. NCVS data shows a very long, pretty much as long as we've been doing the NCVS, property crime has been going down. UCR over the long term also shows a decline in property crime, but it's a bit more jagged. It kind of, the graph spikes up and down a bit more than NCVS. So basically, overall crime's been declining for 25, 30 years now. Uh, so we'll look at some data. So homicide, again, the only source of homicide we have in the U.S. is our uniform crime reports. That's crimes reported to the police. Um, but I mean, we can be fairly confident, and this is an accurate measure of homicide, right? Most homicides do get reported. There's a body, or there's a missing person, and so it's a pretty reliable measure. So this is the long-term shot. It ends in 2006 because I haven't found a sexy graph that goes back to 1900. Um, I suspect this is sort of our lack of good reporting by the police departments. So this is sort of our modern era of reporting right here. So historically, we've gone between roughly 5 homicides per 100,000 people in the heyday of these peaks here. So this is the mid 80s and the early 90s. We got as high as 10, 11 per 100,000, which puts us sort of in the realm of countries like Mexico in terms of comparable homicide rates. Um, So we have experienced pretty high homicide rates. The thing to recognize now is that it's roughly half of what it was in our sort of peaks back when Minneapolis was called Murderapolis. We have experienced historic declines in violent crime, and homicide is sort of the leading indicator. I don't know. One of the interesting things to think about is, why did we have these? There's sort of two ways to look at it. One is historic declines. Two is this sort of a return to normalcy? Is this sort of our baseline normalcy? And if so, why did we experience these sort of horrific spikes in homicide? Um, and so it's fun to kind of play games and say, well, what's going on in this era and what's going on in this era? One of the things students kind of naturally leap to is, right, this is the era of prohibition. The sort of Al Capone gangster wars to control the distribution of liquor that resulted in a lot of homicides. And over here you have sort of the war on drugs, the crack cocaine epidemic, and those sorts of things. Um, yeah, I don't know. Having said that, right, the war on drugs kind of continued past here, so it doesn't do a great job of explaining the big crime drop. By the way, this is a little spike here. This is 9/11, right? And so, one of the issues whenever you're collecting data is what counts and what doesn't count, right? So you had thousands of people that were killed, uh, and they're dead, and they're clearly victims of crime. But if you're doing research trying to explain homicide trends, I mean, do you put them in the data? Because they're really an exception. They're not similar to the other sorts of homicides that we see in the U.S. So do you put them in? Do you not? And the answer is it depends. It depends on the kind of research you're doing. Um, but in this graph, they're put in here. That's what this little spike is. All right, so this is the long-term trend in homicide then. You see it's gone up at times to around 10 per 100,000 or over. And that right now, our last data, I'll show you that, we're below 5 again. So if you think about where we are in terms of homicide through our whole history of our country, we're bumping around what are historic lows. So here's what I'm going to show you is sort of this part blown up to where we are right now. So 2014, I think, is that we bottomed out at 4.5, which again is lower than it was. I mean, we're sort of at Leave It to Beaver land in terms of our violence, right? So very historic lows. We have had an increase in the last couple of years. I think 2015 is our last full year of data, and that went up to 4.88. But in context, 4.88 is still probably right about here, and still relatively low. And so what we're criminologists right now are basically asking: are we kind of bumping around what is the floor of our homicide rate, or it could be this, or it could be something like this. That's just sort of a waxing and waning sort of issue. So again, in context, 4.5, 5 homicides per 100,000 would be roughly 4 or 5 homicides in an area the size of Duluth Superior, about 100,000 citizens. So this is a great example of sort of thinking about stats and where they come from and what they mean. During the Trump campaign, crime once again got pretty heavily politicized. Part of the argument made by President Trump and others was that after decline, things are now getting worse, so they're spiraling out of control. It's horrible. And one of the numbers they threw around was that 2015 saw the biggest one-year increase in homicide in 45 years. Um, Technically, that part was true. What happened then is that different folks sort of butchered that number, and they started making the claim that homicide was higher now than any time in 45 years. And clearly that's not true, right? Homicide right now is at 4.88. That's not higher than any time in 45 years. What happened is that bump from here to here was bigger than at any time. And if you think about it, why is that true? It's largely true because homicide has been going down for almost 30 years. So, um, yeah, it's the biggest increase in 45 years, in part because logs have been going down for 30 years. That any increase is going to be the biggest increase in decades. Um, so yes, the number was technically true, but exceptionally misleading. Another point is that in order for that to be true, you'd have to leave out the 9/11 homicide because that would have made up one of the biggest one-year increases. It's a great example of just thinking carefully about data and where it comes from and what it means. I always tell students to be leery about year-to-year percent increases, especially if you're talking about small numbers. You think about in Duluth, a homicide might go from 2 to 4. Well, that's a 100% increase, but in raw numbers, it's 2 to 4. So the number to look at, and again, you see on the charts, is that, yeah, homicide went up from 4.4 to 4.9 per 100,000, and that's not sort of insignificant. But what we don't know is, is that the sort of leading edge of another trend upwards, or is this sort of kind of bumping around? I mean, we saw something very similar right here and right here. And these increases weren't big spikes. They were just sort of, you see fluctuations before another drop. And it could be, we're experiencing the same thing. We just don't know right now. All right, so that's homicide, and that's all UCR data because the only information we have on homicide is UCR data. So this is what you're looking at now is property crimes from the NCVS. Unlike UCR data, NCVS does per 100,000, I'm sorry, per 1,000 households. All right, so it's household level data. And so looking at this in like 1998, 200 per 1,000 households experienced somebody in the household experienced some sort of property crime. And again, that could be simple theft. Somebody, you left something laying out and somebody swiped it. So again, almost since we've been measuring it, with this one exception right here, those property crimes have fallen fairly steadily and fairly dramatically. This is the violent crime rate from, again, NCVS data. So every year we ask people, have you been a victim of assault, and so on and so forth. And this sort of mirrors what we see in homicide, right? That since the early 90s, there's been a pretty substantial drop in violent crime. So as sort of a check on UCR data, it's comforting from a numbers perspective to see that the NCVS shows the same thing as the UCR, that violent crime has dropped, and it's dropped pretty dramatically in the past 30 years. Now, one of the things to point out is that, I've been talking about United States crime rates, and there's a big difference in terms of where you live in the U.S. And just for an example, for our context, I'm giving you all UCR data, and it's the difference between the U.S. levels, which are on top, and the state, which is on the bottom. So in the United States, we had almost 16,000 homicides in 2015, and that's the 4.9 per 100,000. In contrast, in Minnesota, we had 133 homicides for a homicide rate, about half of what the national average is. So living in Minnesota, your odds of becoming a victim of homicide are half of what they are in terms of living in the United States generally. And you see roughly the same thing for your odds of being robbed or being a victim of aggravated assault. The one difference is the statistic on rape right here. And again, I suspect this is a great example of the limits of data and thinking about what this data is about. So my heavy suspicion, why would it be that Minnesotans are more likely or less likely to kill each other, rob each other, and assault each other, but are more likely to rape each other? It doesn't make much sense. Those things should all kind of hang together. My suspicion is that Minnesota has always been pretty progressive and a national leader in assisting those who are survivors of sexual assault and rape. And so I would bet that this isn't sort of a real difference. It's a difference in reporting. In Minnesota, I suspect women are a lot more comfortable getting help, finding help, and ultimately reporting those crimes to the police. It'd be a good research project to go dig those numbers out and see if that's actually true. I mean, if not, you'd be hard pressed to figure why Minnesotans would be violent in these three categories and less violent in these three and more violent in this one category. There's a lot of variation depending upon what state and what city and even what part of the city you live in terms of your odds of being a victim of crime. The other issue is to sort of back the lens out even further and say, what do we know about the United States versus other sort of similar countries to us, other what folks call industrialized countries? Like, how do we stack up with Canada or Australia or Great Britain or Japan? And what we know, and we'll delve into this more when we talk about violence at the end of this course, but conventional wisdom used to be that the United States had exceptionally high crime rates. In fact, there's theories of crime that are built on that idea. What we now know, because our data is better, is that the U.S. is sort of, with respect to violence short of homicide, we're kind of middle of the pack, that we're not much different in terms of intimate partner violence or aggravated assaults than a place like Canada or Great Britain. We are below average with respect to a lot of European countries and with respect to our property crime. So property crime is much worse in a lot of other places than it is in the U.S. By the way, we know this because when was it? And I think it was in the mid to late 90s. We started to do victimization surveys that were cross-national. So just like we asked victims of crime in the U.S., or citizens, have you been a victim of X, Y, and Z? We did the same thing in Canada and Great Britain and Japan, and that's when we started to realize that the U.S. really isn't exceptional. Now, where we are exceptional is homicide. Our homicide rate is 5 to 10 times higher than in all of those comparison countries, especially when you look at homicides caused by guns. So, but having said that, so part of our exceptionalism is that we kill each other with guns a lot more. But even if you take guns totally out of the equation, we're twice as likely to kill each other than people in other countries. So even after a huge drop, right, our homicide rate dropped from 10 per 100,000 down to 5 per 100,000. Most comparison countries like Canada and Japan tends to be coming around less than 1 per 100,000, and we are still at 5 per 100,000 roughly. So we still kind of stick out in terms of our likelihood of killing each other. But for the rest of crime, we don't. That's a sort of an interesting puzzle. Like, why are Americans more homicidal but not necessarily more criminal? And it's something we'll talk about when we talk about violence later. So the last full year of data that we have is 2015. You can get 2016 estimates right now based on a half of a year of data. But 2015 was the first year where things got a bit murky, where everything didn't sort of line up between UCR and NCVS. So the NCVS data basically shows crime went down again for property crime. In fact, both UCR and NCVS agree at that point that we're now at historic lows for being victims of things like burglary and theft. Where you see the difference is violent crime. The UCR shows violent crime going up 3%. So that's the combination of homicide, robbery, rape, and aggravated assault. In contrast, the NCVS shows a 12% decline. It's a pretty big difference. And there's an article. One of the articles I put on Moodle was sort of what the hell's going on here. And their conclusion was, by and large, the number that drives that rate is aggravated assaults. It's by far the most common of the four crimes. And what seems to be going on is that police have become more likely to define assaults as aggravated rather than simple assaults. So in the NCVS data, you see a reduction in aggravated assaults, but in the UCR data, you see a pretty big increase in aggravated assaults. And so that might be part of what's going on. Where you are, where we're sort of more confident that there's an increase in violence is homicide, and that only comes from the UCR. And as I said, that's sort of up from 4.4 to 4.88 per 100,000. And even there, it's not sort of even. That almost all of that increase came from Chicago, Washington D.C., and a couple other areas. Our biggest cities had a spike in homicides, which sort of drove up the whole national average. But in other cities, homicide's still going down. In a lot of cities, it hasn't done anything. So my take is that 2015 is a bit murky, and we're going to have to wait and see whether this is the start of a trend or whether this is just sort of bumping around at some baseline. This gives you the next two charts are sort of just for context and overall. So this is UCR data, and this is that last year, right? So people are talking about huge increases in violence. Keep in mind that this is what they're talking about right here, and you can make your own judgment as to whether that's a huge increase or not. And that's only in the UCR data. Here's the NCVS data. Same year, it's tracking down a little bit. And so, like I said, over time, these two sources tend to agree, right? Like if you look at the long-term trends for both of them, they're pretty consistent. So what we don't know is this sort of in the UCR data, is this sort of a bump up right here that's going to go back down? Is this a J, or is this the start of something going up? And it's just way too early to tell. All right. The sort of last source of data we have, the most recent sort of data we have, it's interesting is that we've started to use media and newspapers as a way to identify whether crimes have happened when we don't have good data otherwise. And so two examples of that, by far the most long-term one is the START data, which we'll talk about later in the class when we talk about terrorism, but that tracks all terrorist events. So in the whole world, terrorist events are designed to attract attention. The whole point is to kill people so that everybody is afraid. For that to work, the media has to cover it. So it's a good way to cover bombings and shootings and those sorts of things. More recently in the U.S., one of our sort of big controversies right now is police use of force, and specifically lethal force used against citizens. So it turns out police are supposed to report anytime they kill somebody in the context of that UCR data, but most of them don't. And the issue is, we'll talk about this later, but the issue is if police shoot somebody and they view it as legitimate, as a justified use of force, then it's not a crime, and so it doesn't sort of have to be reported the same way. And because our data on police shootings sucks, media has sort of started to use newspaper accounts as a way to track exactly how many police shootings happen and in what context and so on and so forth. So there are sort of ground up efforts by media to start tracking police use of lethal force. All right, so aside from overall trends, what do we know about demographics in crime? Does crime relate to age, sex, race? This is a sticky tab that my son drew when he was like 5 years old. He got left in a minivan after a dispute with his sister, and while mom and sister were gone, he wrote, it's hard to see this, he wrote, "You suck," with a big exclamation point, and this is a dude sticking out his tongue. He was like punished for this, and I came home from work, and he was over in the corner being punished, and it was like, "You show dad what you did," and he showed me that, and I did what most dads would do. I burst out laughing to the point where I was almost crying. I'm like, well, his penmanship's good. The Y is backwards, but I mean, he spelled "you suck" right. And point of it here is that you could have put my daughter in a minivan and given her a giant thing of sticky tabs. She'd never have done this. One of the most robust correlates of crime is gender. So all sources of data agree that males are more likely than females to commit crime. And so the issue is, why is that? At the extremes, if you look at homicide, males commit 90% of homicides, almost 90% of robberies, and so on and so forth. So especially for serious violent crime, it's almost exclusively male. And even for things like theft, theft by check, that women are more likely to commit, men still commit more of them. So, why is that? We'll talk about that throughout the semester, but um, until recently, it's sort of been a sorely neglected area of research. You think about, like, if it's socialization, right? Like, parents parent their kids differently, so parents are more strict with girls than they are with boys. If that's the reason we see these big differences, what that would say is that if you parented boys like you do girls, you could see huge reductions in crime. I'm not saying it's right, but it's a huge policy issue. And I suspect because most criminologists are dudes that we've basically ignored that for a very long time. But in the last 10 years, this has become a really sort of researched area in criminology. So we'll talk about it. But by far, gender is one of the most robust correlates of crime. Every data source ever has shown that boys and men are more likely to commit crime. Race and crime, the answer is it depends. If you look at self-report data, you see very weak, if any, relationships between race and crime. If you look at official data, UCR data, and arrests, you see very strong relationships. And so in the 60s, when we first started doing this, everybody's like, what the hell is going on? Is it that our criminal justice system is just horribly racist? That this says that blacks, whites, Hispanics commit about the same amount of crime, and this says we arrest a bunch of black and Hispanic people, but not white people. What the hell's going on? And so part of the issue, it goes back to data, right? That self-report studies tend to collect a less serious domain of crime than official data. So if we're asking self-report about truancy, lying to parents, drug use, underage drinking, it's not going to surprise most people that blacks and whites and Hispanic, all smoke weed at roughly the same rate. Where you start to see the differences is in the more serious and more violent crime. And so one of the ways to check what's going on here is to use that third source, is NCBS data. And so, when we talk about interpersonal crimes like assault and robbery, we can get some sense of who did it. We can ask people about the race of the perpetrator. And what you find is that there is sort of this true relationship that racial minorities are more likely to commit serious violent crime. Now, one of the big issues we'll talk about is why is that? Now, I highly doubt that skin pigmentation directly causes crime somehow. But in the U.S., right, race is really strongly related to a lot of things, including where you grow up and the neighborhood you live in and those sorts of issues. And those things in turn are related to serious crime. So part of the issue is that there is a difference that's not kind of picked up on self-report. Having said that, there's also evidence, which we'll discuss, that there is some biases in our criminal justice system, right? And one of them is, where do we send police? We tend to send police to poor inner city high crime areas, and if we tell police to be really aggressive in what they do, they're going to pull over more minorities, they're going to pat down more minorities, and they're going to find more drugs and other contraband. And so if you think about it, self-report shows that blacks and whites use illicit drugs at roughly the same rate. However, blacks and Hispanics are much more likely to get arrested for that drug use. So that's an example of bias, but it's not necessarily that police are racist bastards. It's that sort of structurally, we've kind of set it up that way. We send more police into these areas and tell them to be aggressive for ferreting out drugs and other stuff. And when you do that, you're going to drive up arrests for minorities. So it's a complicated thing, and we'll talk about it. We'll touch on it a few times during the semester. That relationship between race and crime. Age is another thing that, like gender, very strongly related to crime. So this is from UCR data. This is the arrest rates per 100,000 for different ages, right? So almost no 10-year-olds get arrested because, we tend not to arrest 10-year-olds. We tend to take them home to their parents. But the overall trend you see here is that crime peaks at a very young age, right? So violent crime peaks in the early 18, 19 years old. Property crime peaks even earlier. Property crime peaks during like 15, 16 years of age. And you can follow this curve out further. The older you get, the less likely people are to commit crime, right? So the age crime curve is that it tends to spike during adolescence and decline pretty dramatically thereafter. And so crime is kind of a young person's game. Not a lot of 40-year-olds committing crime, getting arrested for crime. And so that's one of the other sort of known facts that a good theory ought to account for, this age crime curve. Having said that, one of the kind of interesting areas that's emerged to study is that, and one of the things we know, we've got data where we sort of follow a cohort of people born at a particular time. So if you follow people born in like 1970, and you follow them over time, one of the things we've learned study after study is that there's a very small percent of people in any cohort that do continue their crime into adulthood and late adulthood. And the small chunk of people do most of the damage for that cohort. So somewhere between 3 and 7% of any cohort commit 50 to 70% of crime for that cohort. And so that's another sort of fact that's been demonstrated over and over again, that comes up in theories of crime and policy implications for what we should do. NCVS data and other victimization data has also sort of yielded a treasure trove of information about who gets victimized and why. And so just in terms of a snapshot, a starting point, one of the interesting things is that the profile of victims looks a lot like the profile of offenders. And so one of the things criminologists are trying to figure out is, why is that true? Is it that today I'm a victim, tomorrow I'm an offender? Or is it that we just live in the same area, so that if I'm a young black kid living in the inner city, my odds of victimization go up and my odds of being an offender go up? So the other sort of central finding is that almost all crime is intra-racial. People tend to victimize folks that are of the same race. Most crime is crime committed by people who know each other. It's not stranger crime, and most crime tends to be within race. So, we did a little thought exercise in terms of like what might explain homicide going up and down. It turns out crime trends are exceptionally hard to predict. Nobody really knows why crime increases or decreases dramatically over time. There are always these sort of usual suspects that people talk about, like age composition, right? If there's the baby boomers or the echo boomers from the baby boomers, you have a bunch of 15 to 17-year-old kids, that might drive up crime for a little bit because that's the crime-prone era. People talk about the economy. They talk about social problems like unemployment or divorce or those sorts of things, gangs, gun availability, what we're doing with police, with prisons. The reality is none of these things really predict well or directly crime trends. And there's no better way to sort of think about this than that big crime drop. If you look at what was going on in the 80s and 90s, and I don't know how far I want to back up, everybody, you got to find something that goes far enough back. Everybody here was predicting that things were going to get dramatically worse. They were estimating, homicide rates up in here. It was going to be a bloodbath. We're going to get run over by these super predators. What happened, right? Just at the time when the sons and daughters of baby boomers were moving through their high crime years, instead of crime going up, they plummeted. Um, Nobody saw that coming. Nobody expected it, and to this day, criminologists are kind of trying to figure out how that happened. And you think about this stuff, right? Why is crime getting worse? It's kind of easy to explain. Well, there's more guns, there's more gangs, there's more drugs. Well, ask yourself this, like, are there less gangs now? Are there less guns? Are there less drugs? Right? All the usual things we use to explain crime getting worse, can you flip them on your head and really honestly say that they've gotten better and that's why crime has gone down? Um, so muckety muck criminologists did get together in the middle of this crime drop and do their best to try to figure it out. And there are a variety of explanations that somewhat fit the data. Um, One of the big sort of changes in the inner city, which is what helped drive down these rates dramatically, is that the sort of era of crack cocaine wars ended. It's not that nobody smokes crack anymore. It's that the sort of turf battles for who's going to distribute crack have settled down, and that gang activity that centered around the drug trade has kind of settled out. Um, Other folks, one of my favorite sort of chapters in the book of why crime went down is they talk about different eras in terms of what drug was popular. So uh, the crack cocaine of the sort of frenetic crack cocaine activity of the 80s turned into the blunt. And for the few of you who don't know, the blunt is the hollowed out cigar filled with weed. You just think about like the stereotype of somebody strung on a crack versus somebody that smokes a big blunt. One is more conducive to violence than the other. But people also talk about, people, ethnographers, folks that go and live with and talk with people in the inner city have documented a change in sort of how folks see the world. That in the heyday of the murders in the 80s and 90s, people sort of thought of life as cheap and I'm going to die anyways. And there's been a bit of a change in terms of perspective and culture in these areas. Um, so other thing, I mean, be careful of any sort of one. People say, well, yeah, obviously, we locked up a bunch of people, which is true. We did lock up a bunch of people, and crime went down. Um, the problem with that is you can look at states in the U.S., right? Not every state went on an incarceration binge. California did. Texas eventually did. Minnesota did not. And the issue is crime and violence went down everywhere. So if it was only incarceration that led to this big crime drop, that should have happened mostly in states that made a heavy investment in prison, not in states that didn't. Similarly, yeah, police have innovated in a lot of really unique ways, and it may explain part of the crime drop, but again, that's been uneven across the U.S., and the crime drop has been pretty even, that it's gone down everywhere. So every time I do this face to face, I get somebody that brings up the abortion issue. That one of the hypotheses is that when abortion got legalized, sort of high risk kids that would have been born didn't get born, and so 20 years later, it resulted in crime going down. Um, the problem with that analysis is that it's not clear that the legalization of abortion led to a big reduction in unwanted pregnancies. And so that link has been criticized even by sort of economists that would otherwise sympathize with these folks. Um, the other sort of thing, I mean, it's the same thing. The problem is you can point to stuff, um, lead exposure. Lead is, we'll talk about in biology, but lead is a very toxic substance. It has its biggest impact on kids. So about the same time we legalized abortion, we criminalized lead. So we removed lead from gasoline. We removed lead from paint. And so it's equally plausible that 20, 30 years later, the reduction in violence was that we had sort of lead-free kids. And so the data here actually fits better with this than it does with this. But it's tough analysis to do, and frankly, we don't know for sure what caused that big crime decline yet. I mean, we have some pretty good ideas, but there's still pieces of that puzzle that are missing. And as I said, be leery of somebody who says, well, yeah, the police did their job better. Well, what's going to happen when crime goes up? Are you suddenly going to say, well, police aren't doing their job anymore? Um, the answer is we don't know for sure, and none of these explanations explain the vast majority of the decrease. Last sort of final point to make here is that as a country, we tend to be preoccupied with street crime. Um, and so, as I've pointed out, we have all these sources of information on drug use and robbery and homicide, and we have almost nothing to measure what folks call white collar crime, right? Is insider trading, environmental crime, corporate crime going up or down? We have almost no idea. Um, and part of the problem is that we very rarely pursue criminal cases against corporate criminals. Almost always they end in civil settlements where the corporation or the individual doesn't admit they did anything wrong and they pay a record fine and so on and so forth. And the problem is, well, we'll talk about this later in the semester. The problem is they may pay a huge fine, millions, billions of dollars, but most of the time, the billions of dollars they pay is less than the profit they got from their criminal endeavor. And so my analogy is always like, if you're shoplifting and they caught you and they're like, hey, you have to give back half of what you walked out of that store with, that wouldn't be a real strong deterrent to stop shoplifting in the future. And so one of my old professors, one of the really smart guys I had, he had these little sayings, and one of them was, what's counted counts. And because we count street crimes so carefully and document them, we focus on that. And when we don't count white collar crime, it doesn't get reported in newspapers. We don't know if it's going up or down, and so we don't talk about it. So we will talk about that, but we know less about it, frankly. All right, well, that's a good place to end for now.